Hello, everyone. Welcome to American History 2020, U.S. history since 1877. We're using the American Yawp as our textbook. It's available online. This is Chapter 25, Cold War America from 1945 to 1989. And here we have a picture of Los Alamos testing the first atomic bomb at Los Alamos. You have seen a film recently about this that was popular in the movie theater. So, continuing right along, Cold War began almost immediately at the end of World War II. There was already mistrust and suspicion between the Allies, particularly between Great Britain and the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. Stalin was quite upset that it took so long for the Allies to invade Europe from and open a Western front, during which time hundreds of thousands of Russians died, heading off the Germans around Stalingrad. And so as soon as the war was over, of course, you know from our last session that Harry Truman made the decision to drop 2 atomic bombs in Japan to persuade them to surrender, with the thinking being that the Japanese were resisting so fanatically in the Pacific that if they did the same thing on the Japanese mainland, that there would be thousands of U.S. soldiers that would sacrifice their lives to bring an end to the Japanese Empire, and therefore it was better to save those lives and drop the bomb. And it also, of course, was a warning to the Soviet Union that the United States had supremacy at the end of World War II, because the Soviet Union did not have an atomic bomb, at least not for long, and not at that moment. They did have one within short order. So the defense plants were shutting down, war workers were being laid off, and 12 million job-seeking veterans were on their way home. Home building was picking up. The economy was heading into its strongest boom in American history. They'd exchanged the fear of economic hard times for the fear of communism. The Great Depression had come to an end thanks to the war production. Conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States inaugurated a long twilight era of international tension called a Cold War, during which either side, armed with nuclear weapons, might have tipped the world into oblivion. At home, the Cold War fostered a climate of suspicion of subversives in government, education, and media. And it's a cartoon that illustrates this idea of the world teetering on the edge of a catastrophe because of the atomic bomb. This was 1948 and won the Pulitzer Prize. So, the Cold War began in earnest in 1946. It didn't end until 1989. That would be over 40 years, almost my entire adult life. I was born in 1951, so I was nearly 40 when the Cold War finally came to an end. 45 years later, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War came to an end. It was called a Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States didn't actually shoot upon one another. A hot war would be where the belligerents are actually shooting and killing one another as soldiers. And of course, there was a bunch of proxy hot wars, in Vietnam being the most prominent example, Korea also. There were others in Central America, in El Salvador, Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there were plenty of proxy hot wars, but the Cold War was between the Soviet Union and the United States. Although we came very close in 1963, there was never actually any shooting between U.S. troops and Soviet troops. Both the Soviet Union and the United States, according to our textbook, share some of the blame for starting the Cold War. World War II set the conditions. Germany and Japan were defeated. Britain and France were exhausted. This left the United States and the Soviet Union as the only remaining superpowers. The U.S. and the USSR were divided by ideology, as you probably know. The main problem was in Eastern Europe. At Yalta, and Yalta was this gathering near the end of Roosevelt's life. You can see Joseph Stalin doesn't look very happy there. Winston Churchill and Roosevelt are on the left talking. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to allow Poland and its neighbors to fall under Soviet sphere of influence. Yalta called for free and unfettered elections on the principle of self-determination. Yalta also called for an international forum to discuss issues of mutual importance. This international forum would be eventually called the United Nations. And permanent seats with veto rights for the United States Soviet Union were given on the Security Council. Poland actually would not consent to this agreement with Yalta. There was bitterness between Poland and the Soviet Union. In 1939, Stalin had agreed with Hitler to divide Poland. Stalin ordered the execution of the entire Polish officer corps in the Katyn Forest near the end of World War II in order to eliminate any anti-communist Polish officers. And Stalin also betrayed the Poles of Warsaw late in the war. When they rose against the Germans, the Red Army halted on the outskirts of Warsaw to give the Germans time to kill off any anti-communist leadership. Lots of nice guys back in World War II. This is a picture of Harry Truman, the President of the United States, who took over after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. His instinct was to stand up against Stalin, although he was inexperienced in foreign policy. He used what he called tough methods at the Potsdam Conference in July. With the threat of nuclear weapons, Truman bossed the meetings and told Stalin where to get off. So that probably was not such a great idea. In 1946, George Kennan warned that the Soviet Union was embarked on a trajectory of expansionism. The only recourse was to meet the Soviets with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. Kennan called this long-term strategy containment. On March 1946, Truman announced in a speech that the U.S. would support free peoples who were resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Congress approved $300 million in aid for Greece and $100 million of aid to Turkey. Also, George Marshall, the Secretary of State, came up with the Marshall Plan, which was brilliant, to try to prevent a World War III. If this had been done at the end of World War I, it probably would have made the chances of World War II much less likely. Europe was sliding into economic chaos with people starving in 1947, so Secretary of State George C. Marshall developed a plan to help get European economy back on its feet. He gave a speech at Harvard encouraging Europe to work out an economic plan and promising American aid. The Marshall Plan was criticized by Republicans in Congress. Of course it was. In 1948, the Communists took over in Czechoslovakia. A coup rallied support for the plan in Congress. March 1948, Congress voted overwhelmingly to pass the Marshall Plan. The Soviets were invited to participate but withdrew, receiving the blame for dividing Europe. And Germany was the flashpoint for conflict. So here is a picture of the divided Europe. You see the kind of grayish blue areas. That would be the Warsaw Pact members. The green areas are the NATO members initially, and the light brown is neutral countries. And you see an arrow pointing to Berlin, which was occupied by the British, the Americans, the French, and the Soviets. It was agreed at Yalta that Germany would be permanently demilitarized and pay reparations. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, as I've already noted. The 3 allies consolidated their zones into one allied zone and prepared to form an independent federal German republic. Stalin was opposed to this, and in June 1948 he halted all allied traffic to West Berlin. Because West Berlin was deep inside the Russian territory, they had Allies had to get supplies there, foodstuffs, by a corridor, by truck through a corridor, and so Stalin halted the corridor. Truman and the British were surprised by Stalin. Truman and the British surprised Stalin by taking quick action and developing an airlift. Almost 1 year, the American and British pilots flew 2.5 million tons of food and fuel to West Berlin. The Berlin crisis was the closest the two sides came to an actual war, and the closest the U.S. came to using the atomic bomb against the Soviet Union, at least until 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here is the Berlin. Here's the Berlin airlift. The airplanes are lined up, representing one of the first crises of the Cold War. A U.S. Navy Douglas R-4D and a U.S. Air Force C-47 are unloading at Tempelhof Airport in 1948 or 49. Now we're up to November 1951. I was about 5 months old at this time. May 12th, 1949, Stalin backed down. In April, the U.S. joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization composed of 12 nations: U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, and Portugal, and Iceland. In May of 1949, NATO agreed to the formation of West Germany, which joined NATO in 1955. In response, the Soviets formed the German Democratic Republic of East Germany. September of the same year, the final stage in the process came when the American military intelligence detected a rise in the radioactivity of the atmosphere. The Soviet Union had detonated its own atomic bomb. Truman turned to the National Security Council, NSC, and in 1950 he issued the NSC-68, full of alarming rhetoric, urging a crash program to maintain nuclear superiority. The Americans developed the first hydrogen bomb by 1952, which was 1,000 times more destructive than the atomic bomb. In 1953, the Soviets tested their first hydrogen bomb. Truman accepted NCIS-68, but with misgivings. He eventually turned the control of the nuclear weapons over to civilians, not the military. This was a key decision on Truman's part. Nevertheless, the balance of terror now prevailed. The balance of terror being the mutually assured destruction. So there's a picture of the hydrogen bomb, and let's see, 1954. It was detonated. It doesn't say where it was detonated. I think it was detonated in the Pacific Islands. Tensions began to build in Asia. A civil war was raging in China since the 1930s, and the communist forces under Mao Zedong triumphed in 1949. The remnants of the opposition fled to Taiwan. In case you're wondering where our current tension over Taiwan comes from. Mao aligned himself with the Soviet Union partly out of fear of the U.S., and Korea was the next trouble spot. So this is a picture of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong shaking hands, signifying a relationship between the two largest communist nations, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, counterattacked after there was a attack by the North Korea against South Korea, and General Douglas MacArthur was in the Pacific and in charge of the military forces in the Pacific. 14 nations from the UN provided troops to support the American troops. North Koreans have occupied the entire peninsula except the southeast corner. On September 15th, MacArthur launched a surprise amphibious attack at Incheon behind North Korean lines. And in 2 weeks, the United Nations forces controlled Seoul and land up to the 38th parallel. You can see a map, and here is the 38th parallel. Dawn is right here. That's where the U.S. troops, or the United Nations troops, landed under the command of Douglas MacArthur. And they pushed North Korean troops back beyond the 38th parallel. See that this took its stress upon some of the soldiers. So in 1950, the North Koreans launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel. Truman immediately asked for UN Security Council to authorize a police action, putting Douglas MacArthur in charge of the UN troops. As I've already stated, MacArthur launched a surprise amphibious attack at Incheon behind North Korean lines. And this brings us up to MacArthur ignored Chinese warnings not to proceed further than the 38th parallel. He crossed the parallel and reached the Chinese border on October 9th, intending to liberate all of Korea. There was a massive Chinese counterattack with 300 Chinese volunteers, which attacked in suicidal waves of infantry, recapturing Seoul in January 1951. The American forces again counterattacked and gained the 38th parallel once again, where a stalemate set in. MacArthur denounced the stalemate and wanted total victory. He wrote a highly critical letter to the Republican House Minority Leader. It sounds kind of familiar with recent events with Bibi Netanyahu. Never good when military leaders try to mix in with politics. Truman relieved MacArthur of command for insubordination. And MacArthur failed to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1952 and faded from public view. Actually, the Republican convention in 1952 was won by his former boss, Dwight Eisenhower. The war dragged on for 2 more years, and an armistice was finally signed in July 1953. It's important to notice that this armistice was not a truce or a peace negotiation. It was simply a ceasefire. And so, to some extent, the United States and South Korea still exist in a state of war with North Korea and through today. Here are some pictures of some Korean troops, black and white. This brings us up to Harry Truman. 14 days after the Japanese surrender, Truman called for an expansion of the New Deal. Truman affirmed Roosevelt's 1944 Economic Bill of Rights, and which included a right to a useful job, good housing, adequate medical care, which is interesting. That was 1948, 45. And we still don't really have that for some people in the United States. Old age pension, a good education, that could be debated also whether we have that. So don't have generational wealth. Truman was beset by the problems over converting the wartime economy to peacetime. Truman was worried about runaway inflation. Organized labor was stronger than ever. General strikes brought a halt to life in 1946. Truman's response was erratic. Sometimes he gave in, but often he got tough. In 1946, the Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress. Allying with Southern Democrats, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which limited legal protections of labor's right to organize and engage in collective bargaining. Truman attempted to veto the bill, but Congress overrode him, and Truman became very unpopular. The left wing of the Democratic Party split and supported Henry A. Wallace, who had formerly been President Roosevelt's vice president, but he was dropped from the ticket as being too far left. He was an avid supporter of the New Deal. The right-wing Democrats supported Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. The Republicans nominated Thomas E. Dewey, a political moderate governor of New York. However, at the Democratic convention, Harry Truman surprised everyone and won the nomination. At his rallies on his whistle-stop tour around the United States, his listeners would yell out, "Give him hell, Harry." Truman won 49.6% of the vote to Dewey's 45.1%. Sounds almost like some of the elections we're currently having, where the country is divided almost 50-50. 1949, in the State of the Union, Truman called his program the Fair Deal, as opposed to the New Deal, which he proposed national health insurance, which we still don't have very effectively, aid to education, a housing program, expansion of Social Security and a higher minimum wage, civil rights for African Americans. The idea of a national health insurance was strongly supported by organized labor, but was denounced as socialized medicine by the American Medical Association and the insurance industry, of course. Despite the Democratic majorities, Congress was a stumbling block. The Korean War in 1950 diverted national attention from the Fair Deal. A question that comes along during this period, which is called the Great Fear. This is similar to the Red Scare after World War I. The question was, were there any significant Soviet penetration of the American government? In other words, were there spies in the American government for the Soviet Union? Recent intelligence files have revealed that there was. FDR's assistant Secretary of the Treasury was a closet communist. FDR's administrative aide, mid-level group in the State Department named someone by the name of Alger Hiss, and several hundred more identified by code name. Alger Hiss was serving as the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace when he was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, was launched in 1938. A group of 10 writers and directors went to jail for refusing to disclose the past associations. A blacklist was developed for the movie industry. If I'm not mistaken, John Wayne and, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Ronald Reagan assisted in hounding out writers and directors or actors who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union and making sure they didn't get jobs in Hollywood. Correct me on that in the comments if I'm wrong. This is a picture of Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin. Pictured in 1950, he fueled fears during the early 50s that communism was rampant and growing at every level of the U.S. government. Such fears intensified the Cold War tensions at nearly every level of society. And he was a pain in the ass. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to a position of influence near the end of the Great Fear. He delivered a bombshell in 1950 saying that he had a list of communists working in the State Department. He launched an investigation into subversion in the U.S. Army in 1954. He was finally censured by the Senate because he went too far and died an alcoholic. He's trying to build his reputation off of a fierce or fanatical anti-communism. And this brings us to a picture of Ike Eisenhower. On Election Day 1952, Americans were ready for a change. They had five presidential administrations by Democrats, 4 by Roosevelt, and Harry Truman finished out Roosevelt's and had one of his own. That's 5. Dwight D. Eisenhower moderated but did not attempt to dismantle the New Deal. Like Truman, Eisenhower saw the war and Cold War polarities. His administration embraced a defense buildup. Republicans were the minority party after 20 years of Democratic rule. Only a third of registered voters were Republican. From Ohio was Senator Robert Taft, who was popular with Republicans but more conservative. Eisenhower was popular with the general public and independent voters. The Truman administration was discredited due to the Korean problem and corruption. In the midst of all this, we're skipping over several things in Guatemala and Iran. If I get a chance, I'll circle back to those. In 1953 and 1954, the CIA begins its nefarious attempts to overthrow duly elected governments and bring about regime change. And then in 1959, you had the Cuban Revolution. This is a famous photo of Castro and Che Guevara and some other Camilo Cienfuegos and others marching in Havana. Here are some of the treaties that the United States entered into around the world, such as NATO, in order to form alliances to contain the Soviets. Adlai Stevenson in 1952 was the Republican candidate from Illinois. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. He was the candidate for the Democratic Party. He was from Illinois. He advocated New Deal, fair deal policies with literary eloquence. Eisenhower gave simple and unpretentious speeches that were effective with the voters. Eisenhower attacked Democrats with Korea, communism, and corruption. Picked anti-communist Richard Nixon as his vice presidential running mate. Eisenhower was confident as an international leader, but was a novice in domestic affairs. And Eisenhower did not like confrontation. He avoided speaking out against Joe McCarthy. He practiced hidden hand presidency by working behind the scenes. And although at times he seemed inarticulate, he ran a tight ship and was in full control. And you can certainly see that side of his leadership style in Ike, the Countdown to D-Day, where Tom Selleck plays Eisenhower. So he allowed Congress to promote social welfare, including the creation of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He cautiously used deficit spending to boost unemployment. He initiated the federal highway system. So the next time you go for a drive on I-95, I-10, or I-70, remember to thank Dwight Eisenhower. He also formed NASA to catch up in the space race. And he invested funds in college scholarships and education. Overall, he was a pretty good president. One of the things that I would criticize was his appointment of John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State. Dulles' younger brother, Alan, was also the head of the CIA. So a number of changes happened during this time, including the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953, replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who called for peaceful coexistence. Nevertheless, in 1956, Hungary rose in revolt, in part encouraged by some empty talk by Dulles about rolling back the Iron Curtain. Despite Khrushchev's tolerant rhetoric, Soviet tanks brutally crushed the Hungarians. No dissent allowed. And there was no end in sight to the Cold War at this point in time, 1956. Eisenhower focused on limiting the cost of containment. He hoped to economize by relying on the nuclear arsenal. Eisenhower accelerated the construction of nuclear bombs, developed a strategic air command, and the distant early warning line of radar. The Soviets matched the U.S. bomb for bomb. And this led to a strategic theory called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. It was based on the premise that the threat of mutual annihilation would prevent the use of nuclear weapons. Eisenhower had second thoughts about MAD and proposed an arms limitation agreement. Negotiations were ended in 1960 after an American U-2 plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Between 1947 and 1962, the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian colonial empires began to crumble. Both Truman and Eisenhower failed to recognize that the indigenous, nationalist, or socialist movements of the Third World had their own goals and were not necessarily pawns of the Soviet Union. The U.S. believed that these emerging nations must choose sides. This happened in Vietnam, by the way. It happened in Guatemala with Jacobo Arbenz, and it happened in numerous other situations where Third World nationalists were forced to choose sides between the Soviet Union or the United States, even though they were pro-nationalist as opposed to pro-capitalist or pro-Soviet. Eisenhower administration was less concerned about democracy than stability, unfortunately. The U.S. supported governments that were anti-communist. Whether they were dictatorships or democracies was entirely irrelevant. Dulles often resorted to covert operations. He did it in 1953 to topple the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1954, he did it again in a coup in Guatemala against Jacobo Arbenz. This led to 1959, the Cuban Revolution, and shortly after that, in 1961, the flawed Bay of Pigs operation. In Vietnam, the Viet Minh, who were the soldiers who were trying to overthrow South Vietnam, they seized control from the Japanese. The next year, France moved in to restore control. Eisenhower rejected Ho Chi Minh's plea for an American support against the French because he assumed that Ho Chi Minh was a communist. The domino theory was that one communist takeover would necessarily lead to a series of others, like dominoes. In 1954, the French nevertheless were defeated decisively at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords called for elections in Vietnam. But Britain and France, in alliance with Israel, invaded Egypt in order to regain control of the Suez Canal in 1956. Surprisingly, Dwight Eisenhower opposed them and forced them to back down. The president announced that the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that American forces would assist any nation in the Middle East that required aid against armed aggression by communists. Eisenhower sent the U.S. Sixth Fleet to help King Hussein of Jordan. And then Eisenhower did a surprising thing at the end of his administration. He gave his final address to the nation and warned of the growing power of the military-industrial complex, which, of course, Eisenhower had played a key role in encouraging and developing. The military-industrial complex at this point in time employed 3.5 million Americans in the defense and intelligence industries. Even though Eisenhower contributed to the growth of this complex, he feared its implication for democratic people, and he said, quote, "We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process." Sadly, that advice has not been heeded. And let me see where I stand here. I think I'm going to stop here. This is a propaganda poster by the Soviet Union showing a black person lynched from the Statue of Liberty. Somewhat effective propaganda of the Soviet Union about racial tensions in the United States. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you for your kind attention. That was Cold War in the United States, beginning in 1945 through 1989. We actually didn't get to the latter stages of the Cold War. We'll come back to that later. And next week we will move on to the affluent 1950s in the United States, a growth of economic stability and consumerism. Thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.